All right, everybody, welcome back into Mining Stock Daily. We're going to spend some time talking about the global economy on the back of commodities, specifically the metals trade. I'm happy to welcome back in after it's been a long time since we've had him on the podcast, but Simon Hunt of Strategic Services, Simon Hunt Strategic Services, that is, he is the man there, Mr. Simon Hunt. Simon, welcome back.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening to you, located in Dubai. It's an early morning for me as well as I don't even think my kids are up yet, getting ready for school. So that's what we're working with here. Simon, it's a pleasure to have you back on. Listen, we've had a big move in the entire commodities sector. We're actually seeing this on the back of a dollar rise, which is very interesting as well. Before we get into this, the crux of this conversation, I want to talk to you a lot about the copper market right now, what you're seeing, global demand and supply, specifically China. But before we kind of dive into that, I would love to kind of get your sense of how you're watching the global economy right now and kind of the thesis that's kind of formulating in the back of your head.
Well, that's the fundamental question to be answered before you get on to copper, because it is the global economy that drives copper consumption and thus prices, and not EVs, renewables, and all of that nonsense. Excuse my language. So where are we today? I think the world is sitting on a very important, pivotal point. Pivotal because there is tensions between the Western world and the rest of the world, or to put it bluntly, between America versus Russia, China, and the rest of BRICS. How that plays out is going to be key, but it is against a background where, despite some very recent improvements in PMIs, they may actually be showing a false start, because if you look at real money supply globally, E7 plus G7, you're not seeing that recovery. So I suspect that this is a false start. Though having said that, talking to fabricators in Europe, or the industry in Europe, they are seeing an improvement in order books over the first quarter. Though when questioned a bit more deeply, the answer is we're trying to be optimistic. Yes, there is an improvement, but then we had very bad first quarter. My own view is it is a false start. When you look around the world, the financial system is very fragile. The US economy is not the gangbusters economy that it is being talked up to be. The GDI numbers for the fourth quarter finally came out. I think it was yesterday. It did show a bump, but year on year, gross domestic investment only rose 0.5%. versus GDP's increase of 2.5%. Historically, these two measures have been pretty close together, but since the end of 2022, the gap has widened. And many economists and myself, we prefer the GDI figure as being a more accurate view of US economic activity. Interestingly, Larry Summers just recently, I can't remember, I think it might have been on Monday, threw the cat amongst the pigeons by taking inflation back to prior to Arthur Burns, who started meddling with the inflation and employment numbers in the 1970s. And Larry said, when I said that when you go back to the original workings of CPI, before successive administrations meddled with the numbers or the workings, CPI peaked last year at 18%, 1/8. That tells you why so much or so many of households, probably over 80%, have been penny pinching. And so my take is also, when you look at what's happening in the wars over Israel and over Europe, Putin has now taken the gloves off after the attack at the concert hall outside Moscow. He hasn't put together all the evidence yet that it was orchestrated by the intelligence services of the US, UK, and Kiev, but enough to know that it was Kiev. And probably, given that the head of the intelligence service in Kiev is a CIA stroke MI6 stooge. So when he has collected the evidence to his satisfaction, you can expect retaliation. Already, he is retaliating in Ukraine. Gloves are off. It's war. Simple as that. So with zircon hypersonic missiles, he's been destroying power stations, other infrastructure, oil and gas storage facilities. And more recently, since the 22nd of March, he has destroyed with a hypersonic missile a NATO bunker 6 stories deep, in which all the NATO officers were killed, including a senior Polish general. So that just illustrates that there's a real war on now. And the signs are that NATO countries will get more directly involved. Let's leave it at that.
Okay.
And in the Middle East, Israel's bombing of Iran's embassy and consulate in Damascus is effectively a declaration of war, because Israel has bombed Iranian territory. And under international law, that is an act of war. So what does this mean? What it means, in my view, is that what Iran does will depend on what China and Russia advises Tehran to do. But given what's happened to Russia with the attack on the concert hall, there's a real chance that with the Syrian-Russian treaty, Russia will come into the fray. And will that mean that Iran comes into the fray? We'll have to wait and see. So all I'm saying is you've got the impact of wars escalating, which sooner or later will impact the global economy and metal consumption. There are other developments, such as the rumors that central banks want to introduce central bank digital currencies pretty soon. But in order to do that, they'll have to shut down the banking system first. So when you look at the potential shocks, and I've just named a few of them, are you going to be that ebullient about economic growth? And is this rush by funds and investors and algos into the copper market a realistic move? Is it a false start? So voila.
Take a breath after that.
Well, you did ask me.
I did ask you. No,
Well,
you're
you've
right.
got it.
I know, and
And
I,
you've
you know,
got it.
I was surprised and wasn't prepared to, be talking about an onslaught of the next stage of a potential, World War III here. And I absolutely understand where you're coming from on the Russian side, given what happened with the concert hall in Moscow. Um, this news out of the Iranian embassy is relatively new for us. But it's in thinking about this, and I absolutely understand what you're saying here, Simon. I understand how you're watching the world evolve right now. But you have the benefit of living in Dubai. Here in the West, I almost feel like most of us are asleep at the wheel watching some of this news.
I think you're right.
Right.
There's such a huge dichotomy between really what's going on in the world and equity markets.
Yes, absolutely. So, maybe let's talk about metal consumption. I mean, just in general, before we dive into copper, because we're starting to see a lot of the Department of Energy here in the U.S. just this morning announced almost $60 million for a magnet manufacturing plant by MP Materials that's based in Texas. And we started to see more tax money being driven into the electrification of the world. But what we really haven't seen much of is tax driven money moved in supply chains for national defense. It's been more on the back of energy and this energy rejuvenation, I guess you could say, a renaissance. On your end, are you starting to maybe see the other side of that? Is there starting to see more money being developed for supply in defense materials in the West?
You mean new mining projects?
Yeah, yeah. Things that we would need as far as like heavy metals for munitions.
For munitions?
Yeah.
Well, I did a study about 4 years ago saying that by 2026, 2027, copper used in war needs will exceed copper used for EVs and renewables. And of course, I got a great big whoops. What's that?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is very simple. Modern warfare needs very sophisticated, large data centers from which pilots, drone pilots, can operate. And these are completely self-contained electricity generators, air conditioning, etc. They are highly copper intensive. And they're not just the odd one, they're hundreds of them. So, yes, copper used in war is and will become increasingly important. But you come back to the basic thesis, which is that it is the global economy that drives copper consumption. And where is the global economy going? There's a big pushback already on EVs. There's a huge element of substitution going on in wiring, switching from copper to aluminium. Like 80% of the wiring will be aluminium, weight saving and price. But the fundamental question is, there is this big pushback because households are seeing the real costs of owning an EV in terms of insurance, how many miles can I travel without going into a recharging station, and how long do I wait there? The costs have started to mount up. And you have in America, the dealers are awash with EVs that they can't sell. In the UK, it's exactly the same. People are simply walking away from them. On renewables, they depend on subsidies. And how much longer can governments afford the subsidies? Look at some of the big players in that field. They've lost huge amounts of money. So the reality is there is going to be a pushback on that. And I mean, I could go on, but I won't. But it all comes back to what is the strength of the global economy. And there is a modicum of optimism now within the trade, but it's only a little bit like, yeah, April, May order books are better than the first quarter, but the first quarter was bloody awful, excuse my language. And is that sustainable? I suspect not, because of the many shocks that the system is going to be hit with. But you asked about China.
Yeah.
What is interesting is that the government's focus on growth in China is on the manufacturing sector, not property. And if you look at a graph that shows property versus manufacturing, manufacturing has just gone up like that. Property's gone down like that. So the government is focusing on its key sectors in manufacturing. What a lot of people don't appreciate is how automated are China's factories. I mean, I can remember back in the mid-1990s going around a new aircon, an ACR2 factory. There was about only 2 workers there. That's just mushroomed right across. And again, what China has are these very deep, highly efficient supply chains. It doesn't matter what the currency is going to, the CNY is going to be. It's a fact they are fundamentally more efficient and cheaper to produce anything from appliances, EVs. I think the low-cost EV in China is something like $9,600, and the lowest cost in America is something like $36,000. And then it's the same with nuclear power per gigawatt in, God, what were the numbers? The differential is a 4-to-1 differential. And that's about it across a whole stream of things. So, yeah, at the moment, nobody loves China. I think China is going to have a cyclical recovery this year. The focus is on manufacturing. I think in the second half of the year, that will lead into increasing copper demand. At the moment, at wire rod and brass mills, business is very sluggish, quote, end quote. But second half, I see a very strong recovery. I'm not sure that we will see that same recovery in the rest of the world for the reasons I've just described. The question then is, I mean, the big issue comes back to what we've been talking about for about 2 years, shortage of concentrates, global shortage of concentrates. And I think it was last Friday, the smelter group in China met. Call it the club. and they deferred any decision on cutbacks. Don't forget that in the second half of this year, China's smelt capacity will increase by between 800,000 tons and 1.2 million tons. How much of that's going to be cut back? The decision to cut back has gone back to the board of directors. That was decision one. Decision two is whereas normally they agree that they won't buy concentrates below a certain level for TCs. What they agreed this time, a smelter can make its own decision. If it wants to buy TCs at $10, that's okay. And the way that TCs are going to go, it's perfectly possible that by the end of the year, there won't be a plus against the number, but a minus.
I was going to say, Simon, I've heard reports that some smelters are actually paying for concentrate just because there's a need for feed into.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
As I said, I hadn't realized from my discussions that there was yet a minus figure behind them.
Well, and maybe we could dive into why that is right now. I mean, is it a lack of feed or a lack of demand?
Well, let's talk about the feed first.
Okay.
With the closure of Cobre Panama, and the reality has been for a number of years that the copper content of concentrates has been that smelters actually receive has been something like 4% lower than what has been published by different people. Then on top of that, you've had mining problems in different parts of the world, supply disruptions, logistical issues in Africa, and finally the closure of Cobre Panama. So the bottom line is there is not enough concentrates to feed global smelters operating at normal levels. Now, China is the big player in the smelt market. what's going to be their policy. We don't know yet because they've not yet made a decision. But if I had to guess, I will say that the way China does operate within the country, that ways will be found for smelters to pay anything for the concentrates that they need. There will be cutbacks. You won't get all the 800,000 or 1.2 million tons coming through, but enough for their own requirements. And what will they also do? They will be very aggressive in the market, in the global markets, for scrap, anodes, and blister. So you have a shortage of concentrates, you'll balance it somehow or other by an increase in blister, anodes, and scrap. And if you looked at what they imported for those items last year, I can't remember the exact figure, but there's an increase of about 20%. So if they can get hold of what they need, then it'll be over 20% this year.
So you're starting to paint a little bit of better picture on demand.
No, I haven't spoken about demand. I've spoken about supply only.
Well, you hinted towards demand there as far as a recovery.
There is a modest recovery coming through. Mm-hmm. Now, which was my original economic scenario, that by the middle of the year, you have recession in America, you have recession in Europe, the central banks drop interest rates, provide all the liquidity that markets need, you get an inflationary takeoff, and you get an inflationary demand for copper. So it's not just industry that increases its inventory of semis, cathode, products, components, but it's also the average household. You go out and you buy more than you consume. So that's all part of the inflationary scenario. So the dollar falls sharply, and you will get, just as you had between 79 and 1980, and copper prices in 1 year rose by 75%. We originally had copper rising from a low of, say, 6,500 to close to 14,000. I'm not so sure now that we're going to get that inflation takeoff. The way that events are evolving, I just have a sneak feeling that the crash that we were expecting in mid-2025 will happen this year. And then we go into years of rolling recessions. So whatever scenario evolves, I'm pretty certain that by say the beginning of September, copper prices will be under $7,000.
And that says a lot.
And even by mid this year, because I suspect that there is going to be at least one shock hitting markets before mid-year that's going to knock the stuffing out of them, like the 30% fall in the S&P and other global equity markets. That will shake the bulls in the copper market out.
Mm-hmm. So you see maybe a general false start here in the entire commodities complex, not just
I
copper.
think I think that I think that is the sure bet. I'm still not sure whether I'm going to get that inflation takeoff,
Yeah.
which I call the last hurrah before the big crash. Because the big crash may come this year, just depending on how events develop.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to be, a technical chartist just to look at a lot of the commodities charts here and expect inflation to be picking up in the coming months. I mean, prices are really high. But it's really interesting to look a quarter or two down the road and then see these expectations with the geopolitical risks at hand that have happened in the last few weeks. Obviously, your thesis is one to take account of and consider here, Simon. Um, it's really fascinating. We're recording this today, and actually, markets are starting to fall off a little bit. It's pretty red day. So,
maybe
but
somebody heard me.
yeah, perhaps, or they knew you were coming on to MSD and trying to get ahead of it. But yeah, no, fascinating, Simon. And I know I told you I wasn't going to take much of your time. It's late in the evening over there for you, and so I maybe just give us a sense of where we can find your work, and I would love to have
Yeah,
you on
sure.
again here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, yeah. You can get me on simon-hunt.com.
Okay, yeah, incredible work, lots of insight, and a lot of things to consider. Simon, thanks so much for doing this. Have yourself a great evening.
Well, thank you for having me on.